to Lifecycle Talks, a series of talks presenting the research front to keep you up to date with the science and application of the lifecycle perspective. Today's lifecycle talk is If Less is More, How Are You Keeping Score? Introducing Sufficiency-LCA, where we learn about the assessment of sufficiency understood as living well with less, as opposed to the predominant focus on efficiency. My name is Frida Reine, and I'm happy to welcome our guest for today, Hampus André, researcher at the Department of Sustainable Development, Environmental Science and Engineering at KTH. Before we start, I just want to give you some practical information. All Lifecycle Talks will be published and available on the Swedish Lifecycle Center YouTube channel after the live event has ended. The raise hand function will not be used in Lifecycle Talks. Please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A function. We'll select a few to address during the Q&A session after the presentation. I will start with a warm-up question for you. I'm curious, what motivated you to begin exploring this area of research?
Yeah, thanks. Basically, the realization of two things. First, that efficiency, that is making products less bad environmentally, just doesn't seem to cut it if we want to approach a world that is more sustainable. In addition to efficiency, we need sufficiency. And the second realization is that LCA is designed to mainly assess efficiency. So these two things imply that if we as LCA researchers and practitioners want to truly guide towards a sustainable world, perhaps we need to expand our frameworks and the questions we address.
Thank you, and a warm welcome. It's time for your Lifecycle Talk.
Thank you. And yeah, If Less is More, How Are You Keeping Score? This title is... the words are from a song lyric, which I think really nicely captures the conundrum of sufficiency and its central claim that sometimes less is more, and that our way of thinking is not really ready to see it that way. And today I will outline how we might think and keep score when less may be more. So I'll first explain why this new approach is needed, and then show how we've applied it so far, and also opening up a more theoretical discussion on functionality, which is such a central concept in LCA, and I would argue becomes even more central when we're dealing with sufficiency in LCA. So first, why Sufficiency-LCA? Well, as I mentioned previously, the motivation for this work is really based on two observations. First, that sustainability requires both efficiency and sufficiency. And efficiency is about reducing environmental impacts per product, per level of functionality or consumption. And sufficiency, on the other hand, is about reducing environmental impact by reducing or reconfiguring consumption itself. So striving to live well with less. And as you all know, life cycle assessment is a fantastic tool for studying efficiency, but much less suited to sufficiency, actually. So the reason for this kind of lock-in to the efficiency strategy is the principle of functional equivalence, where we compare alternatives that provide the same function and ask which one has lower environmental impact. So for example, when thinking about housing, LCA allows us to compare different construction materials or different heating systems, so that we can do comparisons like these, but we still want to have the same functionality. So like typically that we only compare houses that are of the same size. If we instead want to focus on sufficiency, so if people choose to live in smaller homes, we're no longer comparing functionally equivalent alternatives, which means that conventional LCA struggles to address the kinds of questions that are central to sufficiency. So sufficiency is a bit of a blind spot in LCA. And LCA is so widely used and relied upon in the guide as a guidance towards sustainability. So if we want LCA to be a more comprehensive tool in this transition, we might need to ask how can we expand LCA so that it can also assess sufficiency. So what's new about this approach then? I would say that there are three key ideas behind this approach. First, that Sufficiency-LCA allows comparisons between alternatives that are not perfectly functionally equivalent, as long as they're reasonably similar. And second, to preserve comparability, we make those functional differences explicit. So we quantify the difference in functionality between the reference alternative and the sufficiency alternative, and we call that delta F. Now, this delta F represents what consumers may potentially be giving up or perhaps gaining when adopting a sufficiency measure. So for housing, this could, for instance, be the difference in floor area between two homes. So the basic idea is quite simple: allow some functional difference, but make it explicit. And since this notion of giving up something, giving up some type of functionality is so central to the sufficiency idea, delta F becomes one of the key results of Sufficiency-LCA. And when we start making delta F explicit, another question arises. So what should delta F actually represent? Is the functionality of a home simply the number of square meters of floor area? Or could functionality also be represented as the satisfaction with one's home or its contributions to need fulfillment or broader well-being? Which brings us to the third idea, namely that perhaps there's a need to broaden how functionality is represented. And interestingly, research on sufficiency suggests that while sufficiency may decrease tangible aspects of functionality, such as floor area, that doesn't need to imply that satisfaction is reduced or that well-being is reduced. In some cases, it even enhances them. So this leads to another important question, like what should count as reasonably similar? Is it similar floor area? Is it similar satisfaction, similar well-being, and so forth? And these are some of the questions that we're currently exploring. So the first exploration of this approach was a case study on remote mountain stations with food and accommodation services operated by the Swedish Tourist Association, STF. And they implemented a range of sufficiency measures, and I'll focus on the ones related to food in this presentation. And they were reducing fresh ingredients to avoid or reduce the need for helicopter transport, and also to reduce meat and dairy because of their known climate impacts, and even closing the restaurant at one of the mountain stations and instead offering an expanded store selection of mostly shelf-stable goods such as ready-made canned meals. And these measures naturally different in the extent to which they were expected to change the dining experience. Some represented relatively small changes, while others, such as replacing restaurant meals with shelf-stable ready-made meals, could be expected to involve some more substantial functional differences. And making those differences explicit is precisely the role of delta F. So what we did was to define the functional units in terms of guest satisfaction with nutritious, tasty, and filling meals during one guest night. And we used a reference functional unit that reflected guest satisfaction before the implementation, and also a sufficiency functional unit that reflected the potentially changed satisfaction afterwards. And environmental impacts were compared relative to the same reference level of functionality. And that's important because otherwise, the environmental comparison could simply reflect that a lower functionality would imply a higher environmental impact per functional unit just because of division with a smaller denominator. And at the same time as we did the environmental stuff, we also measured delta F. So this approach allowed us to explore which of these measures offers the greatest climate benefits per change in guest satisfaction. Now, because these stations are remote, one might intuitively expect that helicopter transport of fresh ingredients could be a big contributor to climate impacts, and consequently that reducing fresh ingredients would have large environmental benefits. However, the largest climate impacts are instead linked to food production, particularly meat and dairy. So reducing meat and dairy actually has the largest environmental benefits. And we also saw that guest satisfaction actually seemed to remain quite stable as a result of both of these measures. So therefore, reducing meat and dairy seemed to be more promising. Reducing fresh ingredients still offered some climate benefits, but the case for doing so was weaker. So replacing restaurant meals with shelf-stable alternatives, that resulted in substantial reductions in guest satisfaction and moderate climate benefits. So this study gives an indication of what Sufficiency-LCA can do. It can help us identify which sufficiency measures offer the greatest environmental benefits, considering these associated functional changes. So in other words, not only exploring whether and how sufficiency works, but also identifying which sufficiency measures appear most promising. Another recent application of the approach was a master thesis study conducted this spring, and it focused on reduced clothing consumption, and did that with a case study on a campaign called Max 5 that encourages people to buy a maximum of 5 new garments per year. And this number of 5 new garments has been suggested as a kind of limit to clothing consumption if we want to live in a 1.5 degree world. So in order to achieve the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement, that's the number of new garments we can buy. And this can be compared to the Swedish average, which is 25 new garments per year. And in the mountain station study, functionality was represented through guest satisfaction. And here we expanded this perspective by using 3 functionality indicators. Well, satisfaction was one of them, clothing satisfaction, but we also had life satisfaction and flourishing, which are more like well-being indicators. So clothing satisfaction captures evaluations related to the consumption domain of clothing itself. Life satisfaction is a reflection of people's evaluations of their lives as a whole. And flourishing captures what is called a more eudaimonic perspective on well-being, related to aspects such as meaning, purpose, living in accordance with one's values, and being a good person, and stuff like that. And this allowed us to explore whether reducing clothing consumption affects different representations of functionality in different ways. Is it possible that we're as satisfied with one's clothing at lower consumption levels? And also a question that many might have, what happens to my happiness if I consume less? So participants who reduced their consumption as part of this campaign did so from around 7 to 3 new garments per year. And comparing that initial 7 new garments on average to the Swedish average of 25 suggests that we're dealing with a population that is quite sufficiency oriented in the first place, so that we need to bear that in mind. But still, this reduction during the campaign translated into around 50% lower environmental impacts. And at the same time, there was no evidence of reduced clothing satisfaction or broader well-being related to reducing one's consumption. And these remained quite stable or actually increased slightly. So altogether, these findings suggest that substantial reductions in clothing consumption can actually be compatible with maintaining clothing satisfaction and also broader well-being, at least among these relatively environmentally engaged individuals. And as we saw in the first slide, the novelty of Sufficiency-LCA, a lot of it centers around delta F. And that raises an important question. What is functionality in the first place? Is it the immediate functions provided by products and services that we focus on in conventional LCA? Or could we think of functionality in other ways, adopting perspectives from other disciplines? So if we define functionality in a technical way, less consumption will imply functional losses proportional to the reduced consumption. In a utilitarian perspective, it's kind of similar, but there you have diminishing marginal utility, which means that reductions from high consumption levels may imply relatively small losses in functionality, and also that large functional losses may result at low consumption levels. If we define functionality in terms of satisfaction or well-being, the picture may look very different. These perspectives often suggest that people adapt to new things in life, including consumption. There's a concept called hedonic adaptation, which suggests that we may become more happier initially, but that this happiness from consumption may fade and become insignificant to one's happiness after a while. So in these perspectives, functional losses may be smaller than expected, they may be negligible, or in some instances, sufficiency could even imply functional gains. And such results are actually quite common in the sufficiency literature, studying concepts like voluntary simplicity and minimalism, for instance. If we instead adopt a needs-based perspective, functionality may remain stable as a result of sufficiency until certain thresholds of needs are crossed. And needs are important, so you don't want to cross those thresholds. If you look at it from a social perspective, functionality of products and services could be construed as they could be whether, like the functionality relevance could be whether we're socially accepted or not. So similar consumption changes in this perspective may imply different delta Fs across contexts. For instance, reducing meat consumption could be something that contributes to social belonging, social status in one context, whereas it could lead to practically social exclusion in another. So that's interesting that it may differ so widely across contexts. And so one of the exciting frontiers for Sufficiency-LCA is not only to quantify delta F, but also engage with the question of what is functionality in the first place. And as we see in this slide, the perspective chosen on functionality could decide whether functionality change is positive or negative as a result of sufficiency. So choosing an appropriate functionality indicator or several becomes very important. It might be that, most probably the functionality indicator, which is useful for a meaningful Sufficiency-LCA, will depend on the scope of the study and the system level of the sufficiency measure, and what people value. And I think this highlights both the promise and challenge of this emerging field, this complexity that is introduced when we start asking these questions. What is functionality? So to conclude, I think there are three main takeaways. First, sufficiency can be assessed within an LCA framework. We just need to expand the framework a little bit, tweak it a little bit. Second, if we relax functional equivalence, functional differences need to be made very explicit. In fact, they become one of the key results. And third, functionality is arguably broader than technical performance, at least in the sufficiency context. And depending on the questions we ask, it may involve preferences, satisfaction, well-being, needs, social aspects. So we've learned some things already, but many questions remain. What should delta F represent? Which indicators are appropriate in which contexts? How should we think about functional equivalence going forward? Is this something that we need to redefine, or is it fine that we just say that, okay, they can be different as long as we can quantify it? And lastly, Sufficiency-LCA is still very much in its infancy. So many of the questions I've touched upon today would greatly benefit from wise and constructive feedback from experts such as yourselves. So if these questions resonate with you, there are several ways to contribute. For instance, partaking in expert reference groups, workshops, and exploring case studies that help test and further develop these ideas in practice. So if so, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks very much for tuning into this life cycle talk.
Thank you, Hampus. Now I have some questions for you, Hampus. I will start with this one. LCA has traditionally relied on strict functional equivalence to ensure comparability. Is there a risk that the methodological robustness of LCA is compromised in the sufficiency approach?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I do think that's a legitimate concern, and that was actually one of the concerns when we submitted the first paper, that relaxing functional equivalence could introduce or could open the door to comparisons that are not so scientific or driven by political agendas and so forth. And yeah, so we thought about that and revised, and I think that a lot of it is alleviated by the explicit quantification of the functional differences. As long as we do that, it's quite settled, like it's quite established. Like we're comparing this to this in both environmental impacts and also the functionality. So perhaps there isn't that need for being strict anymore as long as you do that. And the ambition is to indeed be very scientific about this. That relates both to the quantification of the changes in functionality and also in defining kind of criteria for a redefined functional equivalence, if you will. So setting the boundaries for when can we make these types of comparisons. And I think as long as we're explicit and transparent about that, I think we should be okay. But of course, it's something to be aware about, I think.
Yeah. Another one. In industries working with LCA, how could a sufficiency approach look like in practice?
Yeah, I think that although sufficiency at its core could be like expected to kind of go against the grain of business imperatives, there are a lot of sufficiency measures that you still could introduce in an industry context. So it's not about selling less products, because companies might not want to do that unless you also change the business model. So, but I think since sufficiency is also about what is enough, I think there is plenty to do in a business context. So you could, for instance, identify which aspects of your product contribute most to customer experiences, like which features of products are really valued. So you have kind of like functionality hotspots, the components of products that contribute a lot to customer satisfaction, for instance. And then you pair that with environmental impacts, and then you have like functionality hotspots and environmental hotspots, so that you can identify potentially what to cut back on without compromising customer satisfaction. A bit similar to the STF study, but I think this goes even further in like exploring functionality hotspots. So that's an idea of how it could be used, I think.
Yeah. Then there's someone especially interested in the 5 perspectives of functionality. Where were these originally defined? What is the origin?
The 5, sorry, what was that? The 5 perspectives on functionality.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's ongoing work. They haven't been defined anywhere that I know. So this is just based on reading the sufficiency literature and snowballing, basically. That's how we found these ones. These ones might not be exhaustive, but still they offer distinct logics of how functionality could react to reduced consumption. But yeah, if you have tips on some similar work, that is very much appreciated. But yeah, they haven't been defined, or we're in the process of defining them, I guess.
I assume that you often get asked about rebound effects. What is your view on that? And do you see any limitations in using Sufficiency-LCA in low-income countries or for low-income populations in any country?
Yeah, rebound effects at some point needs to be considered for sure. Rebound effect, or like sufficiency is by no means exempt from rebound effects, although it's kind of often suggested as a response to rebound effects of efficiency measures. But yeah, that needs to be considered somehow, and I think we will make attempts of doing that at some point. A lot of it, I think, comes down to having broad enough functional units, and also looking at the behavioral changes that are likely to be brought about. And second part of the question, yeah, I think the way we've thought about it mostly right now is on kind of the more industrialized world. So kind of like as a way to address overconsumption, but sufficiency for sure is composed of like social floor, where people need to get up over the social floor. If you have like the donut economics model, so that needs are fulfilled. But this approach so far mostly deals with the environmental ceiling that mostly the Western world needs to reshape lifestyles and industrial systems to be within the planetary boundaries. But it's a good point that at some point we should talk about both things when we talk about sufficiency, for sure.
Thank you, Hampus André, researcher at KPH. If you are interested to know more about this topic, these publications are a good start. And all that is listed on this slide can also be found on the Swedish Lifecycle Center website in the calendar event for this talk. The Lifecycle talks are published by the Innovation Cluster for the Lifecycle Perspective and Swedish Lifecycle Center. Thanks for listening. Next Lifecycle talk will be on the 10th of September, and it will be about LCA in emerging food systems. Please follow Swedish Lifecycle Center on LinkedIn and feel free to subscribe to our newsletter to keep up to date with Lifecycle talks and our other events and information.